Notwithstanding.
No. It really was. I didn't know you were doing that actually live. The people smile when you're so miserable.
Johnny Carson was known as the sharpest interviewer on television. He controlled every conversation, every pause, every laugh, and every guest who ever sat across from him. But there was one guest who managed to do something almost nobody else could do in the history of that show. He made Johnny Carson lose control of his own interview, night after night, appearance after appearance. This guest could sit there talking about his own stolen car like it was the most boring detail in the world. He could get his tie stuck in something on live television and treat it like a genuine emergency. He could stay completely silent for several long seconds and still walk away with the biggest laugh of the night. That guest was Tim Conway, and today we are walking through some of his funniest, strangest, and most quietly brilliant moments on The Tonight Show, moments that still hold up decades later because of exactly how little effort they seem to take. What made Conway different from almost every comedian who ever sat in that chair was that he never seemed to be performing at all.
Yeah, well, I've been that close. Quite a bit, as you know.
He looked like a man who simply could not help being funny, even while discussing something as mundane as parking a car or raising children. There was no wink to the camera, no obvious setup, no visible effort. Just a calm, almost sleepy delivery that somehow turned ordinary sentences into some of the most quoted moments in talk show history. Carson starts by pointing out something genuinely surprising to the audience. Despite being one of the biggest comedy names working in the business at the time, Conway has never actually appeared on this particular show before, not once. 16 years of television history, and somehow this is his very first time sitting in that chair. Carson even admits they have asked him before and he never came. Instead of explaining why he kept avoiding it, Conway simply says he never realized this was something Carson actually did for a living, as though talk shows were some obscure side project rather than one of the most famous programs on television. He says it with such total, unshaken sincerity that it almost sounds believable, as if he genuinely thought all those years of casual visits to Carson's own house were just friendly dinners with people who happened to bring film reels along for entertainment afterward. That single moment sets the tone for everything that follows in this appearance. Conway does not perform jokes in the traditional sense, with a clear setup and a clear punchline. He performs confusion, innocence, and total obliviousness instead, stretching it out just long enough that the audience starts laughing before they even fully understand what is happening, and somehow that slow burn becomes funnier than any straightforward punchline ever could. From there, the conversation drifts to Hollywood parties. Conway insists he has never actually attended one, despite everyone assuming a comedian of his stature would be invited to those kinds of events constantly. What he has been to, he says, are birthday parties for cats. The image alone is funny, but what makes it land is the flat, matter-of-fact way he says it, like there is nothing strange about clarifying the difference between a glamorous Hollywood party and a small gathering thrown for someone's pet. He mentions one exception, an anniversary party for a well-known couple in the industry, and immediately admits he was not actually invited to that one either. It is a small detail, but it adds another layer to the joke, the idea that even his one supposed connection to Hollywood glamour was not really his to claim. Then comes the story of his car. He describes pulling up to that same party, a man in a red jacket asking if he could take the car, and Conway simply agreeing without asking a single follow-up question. He even recalls asking if he needed a ticket, and being told no, that would not be necessary. He never saw the man or the car again after that. He delivers the entire story like a mildly inconvenient errand rather than the loss of his own vehicle. There is no outrage in his voice, no disbelief, no urgency. Just calm, quiet acceptance that this is simply what happened that night, and that there was nothing particularly unusual about it. Next, the conversation shifts to family, and this is where Conway does something unexpected. He begins describing himself as the best father in the valley, and for a moment it actually sounds like a heartfelt tribute to fatherhood. He talks about loving his kids, about being there for them from the very beginning, about going through the difficult early years without complaint. His voice stays soft, sincere, almost proud, exactly the way any parent would speak about raising a family. Then, without changing his tone at all, he mentions becoming very close friends with a plumber for 4 or 5 years straight because of how often the pipes needed attention, The warmth of the moment stays exactly the same, the delivery does not shift even slightly, but the meaning collapses into something completely different. That contrast between the emotional setup and the mundane, almost gross reality of parenting is what makes the audience burst out laughing, because nobody sees the turn coming until it has already landed. He continues on this theme, joking about wanting his children to visit him one day at a retirement home, to sit him out in the sun with a blanket wrapped around him. It sounds like a throwaway line, but it lands because of how ordinary and human the request feels, buried inside all the absurdity around it. Carson tries to steer things back into a normal interview, suggesting that two professionals like themselves, both of whom have been in the business for years, should just be able to sit down and talk seriously without all the surrounding nonsense. Conway agrees immediately, almost too enthusiastically, and the audience response makes it clear that any real seriousness is simply not an option in this conversation. The idea of a calm, straightforward interview gets quietly buried the very moment it is suggested, undone by nothing more than a long pause and a wave of laughter, and that alone becomes one of the biggest reactions of the entire segment, precisely because nothing actually happens. Conway then circles back to the story about his stolen car, this time retelling it as if it had just happened all over again, as though he is discovering the loss for the very first time a second time. When Carson points out that he essentially gave his car away to a complete stranger without hesitation, Conway simply shrugs and explains that this is exactly what people do at valet parking. If a man in a red coat asks for your car, he reasons, of course you hand over your keys, because that is the entire purpose of the red coat in the first place. It is presented as simple, unquestionable logic rather than a careless mistake, and that calm, logical framing of an obviously bad decision is exactly what makes the moment so funny. When the topic shifts to money, Conway drops any pretense of artistic passion. He says plainly that he is in this business for the paycheck, and that this is the main thing driving him. Not fame, not recognition, not creative fulfillment, not even ratings. Just the check clearing at the end of the week. He adds, almost as an afterthought, that plenty of paychecks in this industry have not cleared in recent years, but that is a separate issue entirely. It is a rare moment of blunt honesty in an industry built on modesty and false humility, and the audience responds strongly to someone finally saying out loud what everyone quietly assumes but almost nobody ever admits on camera. A little later, the interview breaks down into something almost experimental. Carson begins asking simple, ordinary questions, and Conway responds with the shortest possible answers he can manage. A single word here, a short phrase there, nothing more. He even points out how difficult it is to think of anything interesting to say the moment someone puts a microphone directly in your face, expecting a real answer. The entire format of a talk show conversation gets reduced to almost nothing, yet somehow that emptiness becomes hilarious. The audience seems to understand exactly what is happening, laughing at how absurd it is to watch two people struggle through an interview built entirely on minimal, one-word responses. Then comes one of his most famous stories, about booking an extremely cheap flight to Florida. He starts with a regular airline charging a normal fare, then explains that his wife found an even cheaper option that only cost a few dollars, which felt like an incredible deal until he actually experienced it firsthand. He describes an airline so inexpensive that 37 seats were somehow filled with 1,100 passengers, all stuck on standby together in one long, endless line. He takes the exaggeration even further, claiming that some couples actually met each other while waiting on standby, fell in love, got married, and had children before any of them were ever called for an actual seat. The story escalates so far past reality that its sheer scale becomes the joke itself, and the deadpan way he delivers each new detail makes the exaggeration feel almost believable. From there, Conway introduces one of his most beloved recurring characters, a fictional athlete named Dunk Dorf. He explains, completely straight-faced, how this character evolved over time, starting out as a weightlifter, later becoming an elf, and eventually transforming into a professional basketball player in the NBA. He talks about coming up with the idea in the shower one morning, crediting his own son for supposedly doing the echo effect that made the bit even funnier. Every new detail he adds sounds more ridiculous than the last, yet he presents each one with total confidence, as if Dunk Dorf's imaginary career is something the audience should already be following closely, the same way they might follow a real athlete's season. Then there is the moment everyone remembers, the tie. Somehow, Conway's tie gets caught in something on set, and instead of simply removing it or brushing it off, he treats the situation like a full-blown emergency. He apologizes for being late as if he had just walked in from somewhere else entirely, insists his children gave him that particular tie, and refuses to let anyone cut it loose no matter how tangled it gets. He negotiates, hesitates, and reacts as though this small mishap deserves the same seriousness as a medical crisis. It never turns into something overly loud or exaggerated. He keeps just enough restraint in his voice and his movements that the moment stays believable, which is exactly why it works so well instead of feeling like slapstick for its own sake. Later in the show, Conway steps into one of his most iconic characters, a preacher named Raleigh Tucker delivering a sermon about the dangers of drinking. He speaks with the same rhythm, cadence, and conviction you would expect from an actual religious sermon, drawing out every word like he is speaking directly to a congregation. That authority makes every ridiculous statement that follows land even harder than it otherwise would. He warns about drinking making a person slip, slide, and fall down drunk, all delivered with total solemnity. Then, without ever breaking that same tone, he declares that when it comes to liquor, as for himself, he loves it, and he recommends everyone stop by their local tavern to pick up a jug of their own. The contradiction between his dignified tone and his ridiculous words becomes the entire joke. He never breaks character, not even slightly, and that unwavering commitment is what turns a simple bit into something people still quote decades later. Perhaps the most impressive moment of the entire appearance comes when Conway casually mentions that his car has now been repossessed, on top of everything else that has already gone wrong for him that night. Instead of rushing into another joke to cover the moment, he lets a long, uncomfortable silence sit in the room. Nobody speaks. He references how audiences at his live shows already know his old sketches so well that they start saying the lines along with him, so this time he decided to simply stop and see what would happen if he gave them nothing at all. The audience begins laughing simply because of how uncomfortable that silence feels, and Carson's attempts to move the conversation along only make the moment stretch even longer, adding more tension with every second that passes. Conway never breaks that stillness first. He waits, completely comfortable in the quiet, letting the tension build until the entire room cannot help but respond on its own. It is one of the clearest examples of comedic control in the whole appearance, proving that saying absolutely nothing can be funnier than any line of dialogue ever could be. He returns to the preacher character one more time before the segment ends, repeating that same fake solemn tone as he tells the audience that if they have not tried drinking, they should stop at their local tavern and pick themselves up a jug. The crowd reacts immediately, not because the line itself is new, but because of how completely he commits to the delivery every single time he repeats it, as if he is discovering the joy of drinking all over again in that exact moment. By the end of the show, it becomes obvious that Conway was never trying to overwhelm the audience with jokes stacked on top of each other. He built laughter out of restraint, timing, and total commitment to whatever ridiculous idea he introduced, no matter how small it seemed at first. He turned simple confusion into charm, small inconveniences into full-blown disasters, and total silence into one of the biggest laughs of the entire night. He proved that a comedian does not need to reach for the loudest reaction in the room, that sometimes the quietest, calmest delivery leaves the deepest impression on an audience. Somehow, across this single appearance, he managed to make Johnny Carson, widely regarded as the most composed and controlled host in television history, completely lose control of his own interview, over and over again, without ever raising his voice once. Which moment from this appearance do you think was the funniest?